Hi guys, here I'm going to show you how to have a variable number of arguments for your UDFs in Excel, your user-defined functions. So we have got a UDF here, a function I created, and at the end I can have pretty much as many arguments as I would like. And that's what I'm going to show you how to do today, and we will be covering the VBA so that you understand exactly how it works. Before we start, check the video description and click the link to TeachExcel so you can download the files for the tutorial and follow along. And make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials. Now for this tutorial, I'm going to be using the combined values UDF that I created for another tutorial. Now if you watch that entire tutorial, I do go through in that tutorial what I'm going to go through here. However, that was a rather long tutorial. Most of you didn't watch the full 35 minutes. So here I am only going to cover having a variable number of arguments for the UDF. If you want a more complete explanation of how to use this function, search for the combined values function tutorial. Okay, so here we have this lovely function to combine text, and we have really only three arguments for it. One is a delimiter, what we're going to put in between the pieces that we combine. One is if we want to ignore empty cells or not. And the third, final, awesome, cool thing is an argument that allows a variable number of arguments. So here we have a range of cells that have been selected, A4 to D4. We have a single cell that's been selected, D2. We have some input text there, okay, and another cell that's been selected. So we've got some different things, and what we want to do is to be able to go through every element within every cell and every argument here. So what I'm going to do, let us copy this, get out of that. That's what it looks like when it is finalized. Now let's hit Alt F11 to go to the VBA window. I'm going to make the text bigger and paste in the formula right here. Okay, so here is our formula. So this is what we're going to be using, and I'll leave it here so we don't have to switch back and forth between the spreadsheets and here. And if you download this workbook, highly recommend it. No point to type all this out by hand. Go ahead and just go to Module 1. Or if you're inputting it yourself for all UDFs, remember you put them into modules, so insert module and then put it in the window that pops up there. Okay, so now we've got our UDF. Let me close these windows, give us some more space. Now for UDFs, I'm going to assume that you have a basic understanding of how they work. If not, wait till the end of the tutorial where I'll cover them more in depth. For now, let's focus on the variable number of arguments. So here in our arguments, where we say what arguments we're going to have, we've got a delimiter, we've got an ignore empty, and we've got a little dude down here. Now remember, for arguments, you can name them pretty much whatever you want, delimiter, and that's what we're going to use that name to reference it lower in the code. You don't have to declare it as a string or the type of variable. However, it does make life a little bit easier once you get to more complex macros. So here we have said that this argument delimiter is going to be declared as a string. This argument ignore empty is going to be declared as a boolean, and that's true or false. And you probably say the word different than me, but that's okay. But here, I'm going to put this on a new line now. A little trick to do this in VBA is just type in underscore and then hit enter, and you can put things on a new line. Let's give this another space. This is the variable number of arguments argument, if you will. And that is exactly how you put it in. You type param array, just like this. Then you type the name of the variable. You will use this lower in your code. Open and closing parentheses, and then as variant. As variant means that it can be any variable type. So the only thing you need to change here is text. Change it to whatever word you want to use lower in your code. This does need to be the last argument. Obviously, if you don't know how many arguments there are going to be, how many cell selections, or how many different versions of the text you're going to input in there, well, you need to put it at the end of the function. So this always has to come at the very end. So we have our text variable, and now we can reference that within our macro and do something with it. So this variable right here is going to hold everything right here. This range reference, A4 to D4, the cell D2, OK, and A2. So now that we've got all of that in a nice, neat variable, we need to be able to go through it and do something with it. And that is easier said than done. So let us move on to the macro now. This right here, I'm declaring 4 variables, and this is what we need in order to go through the text, the param array up here. It's what we need to go through that variable and actually do something with it and then save the output. But let us get into the code so you can better understand them. So down here, this is where we work with I. I is usually a counter variable, and that just means that we're going to increment it to know how many times we're going through loops. And you can see I have a lot of comments here from the previous tutorial, so I'm going to leave those in. They're quite helpful. This is our counter variable, help us build the array that will hold the output. So that's what we're going to use this for. So we just set it to 0 because we have not looped through anything yet. So you'll understand what I means in a few minutes. Now we have our counter variable set up, it's set equal to 0. Now let's go ahead and loop through the data, because to go through our variable number of arguments, we need to loop through them, because we don't know how many they're going to be. So we use this pretty cool loop right here, loop through all of the values that we would like to combine. So this is the for each loop. It's pretty cool. What we do is we take right here the name of our variable argument, text. So it's the same as this guy right here. We put that at the end. It goes through everything in the text variable, and each time that it goes through that element, it assigns that element to piece. So that within this loop, as we go through everything in text, we can reference each element using piece. So here is everything that is stored within text. And when we go through it the first time, piece will be equal to A4 to D4. We go through it the next time, it'll be equal to D2. The next time, OK, and the next time, A2. It's a little hard to select things in this stupid editor, but there we go, A2. So the for each loop right here encloses pretty much all of the code. At the very end of our for each loop, we simply type next. That just says keep going. So you need next at the very bottom of the loop, and for each up here. So this allows us to go through each piece individually. And piece, pretty easy to remember. So now that we're inside the code, we can just use piece to refer to it. But of course, you can see that these are not all the same. So we have to do different things depending on what type of data we're going to be working with. So the next thing we have to do is to figure out what kind of data we're working with. Are we working with a range or not? That's really all we need to know. We can get into more specifics if it's a string or not, but we just really need to know if it's a range or not. So that is the first thing we do. We check if the current value, the current piece, the current thing we are looping through is a range. We do that by referencing that current thing, that current piece right here. And we use type name. This is an awesome function that basically just is going to allow us to know if it's a range or not. So we use an if statement, if type name piece. So that just says if piece is a range, then let us do something. So if we're here, this piece is in fact a range. Now that we know it's a range, well, we need to actually loop through that range. So we are now going to go into a loop within a loop, because you can look at this as its own little array. So an array is just a collection of pieces. So basically we have 2 arrays. This right here is one array with 4 elements, 1, 2, 3, 4. And this right here is another array with its own set of elements, A4 to D4. So as we are looping through the original 4, once we get to a range, we must then loop through all of the cells in that range. Then when we are done, we can continue looping through the other elements. I hope that wasn't too confusing. It can be kind of confusing when you're dealing with arrays, but the point is now we've gotten to a range here in the code, so we need to loop through it, and we can use our for each loop once again. But this time, since we are working with a piece instead of text, we do for each new variable in piece. So piece right now is the A4 to D4. and we want to go through those cells. So we have another variable, element, and that will be assigned to each cell within piece. So element up here is as well a variant. Variant is what you can use if you don't want to give a variable name a specific type, such as string or integer. You just give it variant and it works. So we have element. Now element is used to go through the piece variable. So for each element in piece, for each cell, this essentially is going to be a cell, for each cell in the range that is contained in piece, let us now loop through that. Let's say, if here we are now looping through a range. And so within this loop, we simply use element to refer to that range, that cell. So, oh, and I almost forgot, of course, remember, for each loops, this is our next that closes the for each loop right here. So this is the entire for each loop here. Where were we? We're going through the range. Now we want to do our code. So once we're here, we are dealing with the actual cell that has the data. We're dealing with the actual data. Finally, we've got to it, our loop within a loop. So right here is where you do whatever you want to do. In this case, we want to check if the user wants to ignore empty cells. So we do two things here. We deal with the ignore empty variable, which is up here, ignore empty, and that is a Boolean, which means it's going to be true or false. And all that we do here is we reverse that. So if not, ignore empty, or not is empty, then we do something. So it goes like this. If element is empty, this will return true, which would make this if statement run, but we don't want it to run, so we use not. So true becomes false, and what's down here won't run. Ignore empty just allows us to override that setting. So if we set ignore empty to false, then this will be false. Not turns false into true, which means that no matter what, we want to use the cell in this code down here. But anyway, this is the one that you're going to use probably most often when you have a variable number of arguments, because most of the time you don't want to include empty cells. But now once you have met whatever condition you want to meet, you get down here and you want to do something, the next step is you're probably going to want to save the value, because in formulas and functions, you can only output them in one instance. You output it in the cell. You have your output, which is at the very end right here. So you just got one dude. So you need to collect all the values, all the data, everything that you want to output here so that you can use it down here. And that's where we use the array. And arrays in VBA are horribly annoying. But we actually only have to do 2 lines of code. So the array, new array, is what's going to hold our output for the end of the UDF. That is declared up here this way. There are many ways to declare arrays. This is a very simple one when you don't know how big it's going to be. And remember that arrays just hold many pieces of data in one variable. So type the name of your array, whatever you want here, open and closing parentheses, and then set it as variant. Okay, now once we go down here, the first thing you have to do, since you haven't said how big your array is, which is what you have to do here, is you tell Excel to make your array so big. And this is where we use the I variable. So I right here, the first time this runs, will be equal to 0. And that's okay because that's how arrays work, starting at 0 usually. So we set the array, we set the size, then we go down here and we say to put this element inside this array. Where do we put it inside the array? We put it at position I. So position I is 0. Once we finish this, we increment I so that it can be reused. So once we come back here a second time, we make the array larger. The second time we come back here, this would be equal to 1. Then we go down here. We set the last position of the array, which is 1, equal to that element. And then we make I larger. So we are expanding the array by 1 on each iteration and putting the element in the last slot in the array. Now redim and preserve are very important. Preserve makes sure that your array retains all the data that was in there before, and redim is what we have to type to essentially redeclare the value. It's rather annoying. No, it's very annoying. But this is how we can save all of the data that we want to output later in our UDF. So whatever you want for your condition, put right here. Then down here, do whatever you want. Your code here. Then, once it meets your conditions, you're very happy, you've edited your text, you've done whatever you want to do in your UDF, go ahead and pop that dude into an array so you can output it at the end of the macro. And that's pretty much all there is to this macro. So the difficult one is to go through the range. So you've done the range, you've gotten everything. This is your second loop right here. Now we're good. This down here is what happens if the value is not a range. Life is so much easier. We don't have to have another loop. We don't have to do anything. We just directly act on the values. And we can use piece here because we're not within another loop. So we directly reference piece right here from the outermost for each loop. So all we have to do here is input our business logic. This entire section, by the way, is exactly the same as this section right here. So I'm not going to cover it all again. But all you have to do here is implement your business logic. And then once you have gotten down here, you can save your results into an array. So the only reason that we had to do another loop, a nested loop right here, is because we're going through a range. Once you're not going through a range that can have multiple cells, you don't have to worry about that jazz. Life becomes easy, but you still do need to input the values into the array variable. Now I'll go ahead and put your code here once again. Okay. Now this is just a template. You can change it however you want. But most of the time you want to ignore the empty cells. So you might not have this dude here for the if check, but you will probably have this guy here. So that's why I say put your code here instead of up here. But do whatever you want. Now we go to the end if and go to the other end if, and we only check two conditions, if it's a range or not a range, because that's all that matters in this case. And then we get to the final loop next, or the final for each loop right here. So once we get to here, we are now out of the loop. You're out of the loop. Do whatever you want. So once you get down here, you are going to have an array variable that has all of the results from your loop in it. So if you just wanted to get the value from every cell, you have now got new array is the variable now holds all of the values from the above loop. So you can now work on new array to do whatever you want. You can loop through it. You can do whatever you want with it to complete your UDF. In this case, for the combine values UDF, all that I do is I pop new array into the join function along with the delimiter variable, which is going to combine every piece of the array along with what I input for the delimiter. So that allows us to output dashes in between every piece or spaces or whatever you want. The join function is awesome. It's in VBA, should have been in Excel from day one, but whatever. And that's really all there is to it. So really quickly to wrap up, just in case you don't know these few things about UDFs or user-defined functions, I'm going to go ahead and give them to you now. For your UDF, do remember that you have to, at the very end of it, put the name of the UDF and equal sign, and then assign it to the output that you would like to send back to Excel. So I said I was going to tell you how UDFs work, and that's the most important one. So the name of the UDF here, combine values. This is what it will be in the spreadsheet, which is why that is the same name as that right there. And if you change this, make sure to also change this down here. You need this at the end of the macro or your UDF will not work. And then also difference between a regular macro and UDFs. You start this one with function and you end it with end function. And in case you didn't watch my tutorial on how to display the arguments, let's go back here. It's this really cool little thing with UDFs. So let's go ahead to start and type the UDF. You'll see that it pops in right here, combine values. You don't get the argument list. Do Control Shift A and it pops in the argument list. How awesome is that? So we can see our first argument should be a delimiter, then ignore empty, and then we have text, and then we have dot dot dot, which is a variable number of arguments. That's what it signifies. It's pretty darn awesome. Or you could do equals, combine values, Control A, and Control A will bring up a window like this, and you know text is a variable number of arguments because once we select the cell, let's go and select it now, we get another one that opens up. How cool is that? So even though you don't get as many helpful features as regular functions in Excel, you still have some pretty cool ways to easily see all the arguments. And once you're done with that, you now have an awesome UDF with a variable number of arguments in it. I hope you liked the tutorial. If it was helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials.